London, 1817. The Duke of Ravenshollow whispered promises of forever in moonlit gardens, his war-scarred hands trembling as they traced Evangeline Ashworth's face. She believed every word, every stolen kiss, every declaration that she alone could heal his wounded soul. Then her sister Lydia emerged from her sickroom like a golden goddess, and everything changed. Within a month, Alexander was on bended knee before the wrong woman, pledging the very words he had once spoken to Evangeline. As wedding bells chimed through London's grandest cathedral, Evangeline stood witness to her own heartbreak, watching the man she loved marry her beloved sister, while her shattered dreams crumbled like autumn leaves beneath the weight of his betrayal. The late afternoon sun cast dappled shadows across Lady Pemberton's immaculate gardens as the cream of London society gathered for what promised to be the season's most elegant musical soiree. Evangeline Ashworth adjusted her pale blue silk gloves and smoothed the modest neckline of her cream muslin gown, grateful that her father had managed to commission at least one new dress for her this season, though she suspected it had come at the cost of delaying payment to yet another creditor. At 22, she possessed what her governess had once kindly termed quiet beauty, her chestnut hair arranged in simple but elegant ringlets that framed features more notable for their intelligence than their perfection. Unlike her younger sister Lydia, who could stop conversation merely by entering a room, Evangeline had learned to rely on her musical talents and gentle disposition to secure her place in society's regard. As she approached the pianoforte that had been positioned beneath a flowering arbor, she caught sight of her hostess beckoning the assembled guests to gather round. The Earl of Ashworth stood near the refreshment table, his face bearing the perpetually worried expression that had become his constant companion since his gambling debts had reached alarming proportions. Her mother, the Countess, maintained her practiced smile while casting meaningful glances at the eligible bachelors present, her calculations as transparent as they were desperate. Evangeline settled herself at the instrument and began with a gentle Mozart sonata, her fingers finding their familiar grace across the keys as the murmur of conversation gradually stilled. Music had always been her refuge, the one arena where she felt truly confident, where her worth was measured not by her dowry or her connections, but by the beauty she could create. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. As the melody flowed from beneath her touch, she noticed the crowd's attention was genuinely captured rather than merely polite, and she allowed herself a small measure of satisfaction. It was then that she became aware of a presence at the edge of the gathering, someone who stood apart from the clusters of gossiping matrons and preening debutantes. Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenshollow, leaned against an ancient oak tree, his dark eyes fixed not on the assembled company, but solely on her. She had heard whispers about his return from the Peninsula Wars, rumors of heroism shadowed by some unnamed tragedy that had left him changed. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw spoke of violence survived, while his bearing suggested a man carrying burdens far heavier than his ducal responsibilities. He was handsome in the way of weathered marble, all sharp angles and hidden depths, his black hair slightly overlong in defiance of current fashion. As Evangeline transitioned into a more complex piece by Beethoven, she found herself playing not for the appreciative audience before her, but for this solitary figure who watched her with an intensity that sent unexpected warmth coursing through her veins. When the final notes faded into the golden afternoon air, the applause was enthusiastic, but Evangeline barely heard it, for the Duke was already making his way toward her through the crowd, his purpose unmistakable. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton simpered as Alexander approached, What an honor to have you join our little musical gathering. I do hope you found our entertainment to your liking." Alexander offered the barest inclination of his head toward their hostess before turning his attention fully to Evangeline. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying the rough edge of a man unaccustomed to drawing-room pleasantries. "That was extraordinary. I confess myself quite transported by your performance." Evangeline felt heat rise in her cheeks at the directness of his praise, so different from the flowery compliments typically offered by society gentlemen. "You are very kind, Your Grace, though I fear you give me too much credit. The music itself deserves any praise you might offer." "On the contrary," he replied, moving closer so that their conversation became more private despite the interested gazes surrounding them. "I have heard that particular piece performed in Vienna and Paris by masters of their craft, yet none moved me as you have done just now. There is something in your interpretation, a depth of feeling that speaks to more than mere technical skill." Evangeline found herself studying his face as he spoke, noting the sincerity in those storm-gray eyes and the way his scarred features softened when he looked at her. "I believe music reveals truth, Your Grace," she said quietly, both in the composer's intent and in the performer's heart. "Perhaps that is why it has always been my greatest solace." Alexander's expression shifted subtly, as though her words had touched something long buried. "Solace," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I can see how music might provide that. I have been seeking such peace myself since my return to England, though I confess I had not thought to find it in a London drawing-room." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of several other guests eager to claim the Duke's attention, but as Evangeline prepared to withdraw, Alexander caught her hand briefly. "Miss Ashworth, I wonder if I might call upon you and your family tomorrow afternoon. There are few subjects more pleasant than discussing music with someone who truly understands its power." The request sent a flutter of excitement through Evangeline's chest, though she maintained her composure admirably. "My parents and I would be honored to receive you, Your Grace. We are at home most afternoons between 2 and 4 o'clock. As the Duke moved away to fulfill his social obligations, Evangeline found herself the object of considerable speculation from the other ladies present, their whispered comments carrying clearly to her ears, despite their attempts at discretion. "How remarkable that Ravenshollow should single out the Ashworth girl for such attention," murmured Mrs. Fitzwilliam to her companion. "One would have thought his taste would run to more obvious charms, particularly given the family's rather strained circumstances." "Indeed," came the reply, "though perhaps the Duke has unconventional preferences. They say the wars change a man's perspective on such matters." Evangeline pretended not to hear these observations, though they served to remind her of the precariousness of her family's position and the impossibility of truly capturing the interest of a man so far above her station. Yet as she gathered her music and prepared to leave the party, she could not shake the memory of how Alexander had looked at her, as though she alone possessed something he desperately needed. The carriage ride home passed in relative silence, her parents absorbed in their own thoughts about the day's social maneuverings. But Evangeline's mind was entirely occupied with replaying every word, every glance exchanged with the Duke. She had attended enough social gatherings to recognize the difference between polite attention and genuine interest, and Alexander Blackwood's regard felt decidedly authentic. As their modest townhouse came into view, her father finally broke the silence with typical bluntness. "The Duke's attention toward you was most marked, Evangeline. I trust you will conduct yourself appropriately should he indeed call tomorrow. Such connections could prove most beneficial to our family's situation." Mother's voice carried a warning note as she added, "Though you must remember, my dear, not to read too much into the courtesies of a gentleman. Great men often show kindness without deeper intention." Evangeline nodded dutifully. though privately she wondered if either parent had truly observed the intensity of Alexander's manner, or the careful way he had chosen his words. As she prepared for bed that evening, she found herself standing before her mirror, studying her reflection with new eyes, and wondering what a battle-scarred duke might see in the face of a plain country earl's daughter, whose greatest accomplishments were her musical skills and her ability to manage a household on an ever-diminishing budget. The grand ballroom of Almack's had never seemed more brilliant than on the evening of Lydia Ashworth's first appearance in London society. After months of confinement due to a persistent fever that had kept her sequestered in the countryside, the younger Miss Ashworth emerged like Venus rising from the sea, her recovery complete and her beauty more radiant than ever before. Evangeline stood beside her parents near the refreshment table, watching with a mixture of pride and trepidation as all eyes turned toward her sister. Lydia possessed everything that Evangeline did not. Hair like spun gold that caught the candlelight and threw it back in glorious waves, cornflower blue eyes that sparkled with mischief and joy, and a figure that made even the simplest gown appear as though it had been designed by the gods themselves. At 19, she moved through the world with the unconscious grace of someone who had never doubted her own worth, her laughter like silver bells that drew admirers as surely as honey drew flies. Tonight she wore a gown of palest pink silk that complemented her porcelain complexion perfectly, and her entrance had caused the sort of stir that mothers dreamed of for their daughters and other young ladies regarded with barely concealed envy. Evangeline felt her own modest lavender silk suddenly seem even plainer by comparison, though she pushed such uncharitable thoughts aside with the ease of long practice. She loved her sister dearly, had nursed her through the worst of her illness, and genuinely rejoiced in Lydia's triumph, even as a small part of her heart couldn't help but recognize how thoroughly she had been eclipsed. The Earl of Ashworth fairly glowed with satisfaction as he watched eligible gentlemen gravitate toward his younger daughter, his calculations already at work determining which of these moths to the flame might prove most beneficial to the family's precarious financial situation. Lady Ashworth's smile held genuine warmth for perhaps the first time all season as she observed the immediate success of her beautiful daughter, though Evangeline noticed her mother's eyes frequently darting toward her elder child with an expression that might have been sympathy, or might simply have been resignation. It was then that Alexander arrived, fashionably late, as was his custom, his dark evening clothes impeccable, and his bearing carrying that same sense of controlled power that had so captivated Evangeline at their first meeting. She felt her pulse quicken at the sight of him, her hand unconsciously rising to touch the simple pearl necklace at her throat as she remembered their last private conversation in her father's library, where he had spoken of duty and desire with an intensity that had left her breathless with hope. He made his way through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to deference, pausing to exchange pleasantries with various acquaintances before his gaze found hers across the room. The smile he offered her was warm and familiar, and Evangeline felt her spirits lift as she prepared to receive him. But Alexander's progress toward her was interrupted when Lydia, surrounded by her court of admirers, turned at precisely the wrong moment, and their eyes met. Evangeline watched with growing unease as her sister's animated conversation faltered, her rosebud mouth forming a perfect O of surprise as she took in the Duke's commanding presence. More troubling still was the way Alexander himself seemed to falter, his confident stride slowing as he absorbed the vision that was Lydia Ashworth in all her golden glory. The introduction was inevitable, orchestrated by Lady Jersey herself with the skill of a seasoned matchmaker, and Evangeline found herself relegated to the role of observer as Alexander was presented to her sister with all the ceremony due his rank. "Your Grace," Lady Jersey proclaimed with evident satisfaction, May I present Miss Lydia Ashworth, just recovered from a most tiresome illness and making her first appearance this season. Miss Lydia, His Grace the Duke of Ravenshollow." Lydia's curtsy was perfection itself, a graceful dip that somehow managed to be both properly respectful and utterly charming, her golden head inclined at precisely the right angle to display the elegant line of her neck. "Your Grace," she said in her musical voice, "what an honor this is. I have heard so much about your heroic service to our country." Alexander's response was everything polite society demanded, yet Evangeline could not help but notice the way his voice seemed to catch slightly as he replied, "Miss Lydia, the honor is entirely mine. I trust your health is fully restored and that you will suffer no ill effects from your previous indisposition." "Oh, I am quite recovered, thank you," Lydia replied with the sort of radiant smile that could have melted winter itself. "Indeed, I feel as though I am seeing the world with fresh eyes after so long an absence from society. Everything seems more beautiful, more vivid than I remembered." The exchange continued with the sort of elevated small talk that was the currency of such gatherings, but Evangeline found herself studying Alexander's face with growing alarm. Gone was the intense focus he had always shown when speaking with her, replaced by something approaching wonder as he gazed upon Lydia's perfect features. Her sister, for her part, seemed utterly unconscious of the effect she was having, responding to Alexander's attention with the same warm enthusiasm she showed to all her admirers, yet somehow managing to make each exchange feel uniquely special. When the music began, and Alexander requested the honor of a dance with Lydia, Evangeline felt her heart contract with something dangerously close to panic, though she forced herself to smile and nod approvingly when Lydia glanced toward her for permission. Watching them move together across the polished floor was perhaps the most exquisite torture Evangeline had ever endured, for they were undeniably magnificent as a couple. Alexander's dark masculinity provided the perfect foil for Lydia's ethereal beauty, his controlled grace matching her natural elegance in a way that drew admiring glances from every corner of the ballroom. They moved as though they had been dancing together for years rather than minutes, their conversation flowing as easily as their steps, and when Lydia threw back her head and laughed at something Alexander said, the sound carried across the room like music. Evangeline found herself gripping her fan so tightly that the delicate ivory sticks threatened to snap, forcing herself to breathe slowly and steadily as she struggled to maintain her composure. This was natural, she told herself firmly. Any man would be dazzled by Lydia's beauty, and Alexander was no exception. It meant nothing beyond the normal appreciation any gentleman might show for a lovely woman, and she was being foolish to read deeper significance into what was surely nothing more than common courtesy. When the dance ended, and Alexander escorted Lydia back to where Evangeline waited with their parents, his manner toward her was exactly as it had always been: warm, attentive, and respectful. Yet she could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. "Miss Evangeline," he said with his customary bow, "you look particularly lovely this evening. That shade of lavender suits you admirably." His words were everything they should have been, yet they felt oddly formal after the easy intimacy they had begun to develop over the past weeks of his visits to her family's home. "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "You and Lydia made a most handsome couple on the dance floor. I do hope you enjoyed yourselves." Alexander's glance toward Lydia was brief but telling, and when he replied, "Your sister is indeed a delightful partner," there was something in his tone that made Evangeline's stomach clench with dread. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and careful conversation, with Evangeline maintaining her role as the dutiful elder sister, while watching Alexander divide his attention between herself and Lydia with what appeared to be growing confusion. She told herself that his continued presence at her side proved that her fears were unfounded, that his interest in her remained unchanged despite Lydia's dazzling entrance into their world. Yet as the night wore on, she could not ignore the way his gaze kept drifting toward her sister, or the subtle change in his demeanor when Lydia addressed him directly. By the time their carriage arrived to convey them home, Evangeline's head was pounding with tension, and her heart heavy with a foreboding she dared not acknowledge even to herself. The ride home was filled with Lydia's breathless recounting of her triumph, her excitement so genuine and infectious that even Evangeline found herself smiling despite her inner turmoil. "Oh, what a perfectly magical evening!" Lydia exclaimed, her eyes still bright with the excitement of her social debut. Everyone was so kind, and the Duke was particularly gracious, such a distinguished gentleman, and so very handsome despite that dreadful scar. "I do hope we shall see more of him in the coming weeks." The Earl's response was predictably calculating, as he observed, "The Duke's attention toward our family has been most marked, and his continued interest could prove highly advantageous. We must be certain to encourage his visits and make him feel welcome in our home." Lady Ashworth nodded approvingly, though she cast a worried glance toward her elder daughter before adding, "Though we must remember that great men often show kindness without deeper intention, it would not do to assume too much from mere social courtesies." Evangeline said nothing, staring out the carriage window at the darkened streets while her family continued their speculation about Alexander's motives and the potential benefits of his regard. She had thought herself prepared for the challenges that would come with Lydia's entry into society, had known that her sister's beauty would inevitably draw attention and admiration. What she had not anticipated was the possibility that the one man whose interest had begun to mean everything to her might prove as susceptible as any other to her sister's charms. As they reached their modest townhouse and prepared to retire for the evening, Evangeline caught sight of her reflection in the hall mirror and was startled by the pallor of her complexion and the shadows beneath her eyes. Tonight had changed something irrevocably, though she was not yet ready to acknowledge the full extent of that transformation. The weeks following Lydia's debut brought a steady stream of callers to the Ashworth residence, young gentlemen drawn by her beauty and charm, who filled their modest drawing room with flowers, flattery, and barely concealed competition for her attention. Among these persistent suitors, Alexander's presence had become a constant, his daily visits so regular that the household had come to expect his arrival promptly at 3 o'clock each afternoon. Evangeline had initially taken comfort in the continuation of his calls, interpreting them as evidence that his feelings for her remained unchanged despite her sister's dazzling presence. After all, he continued to seek out her conversation, to discuss books and music with the same intensity as before, and to show every sign of a gentleman whose affections were firmly fixed. Yet as the days passed, she began to notice subtle changes in his behavior that filled her with growing unease. Where once his attention had been focused entirely on her during these visits, now she observed his gaze straying frequently toward Lydia. His conversation interrupted whenever her sister entered the room, and his manner taking on an almost breathless quality when Lydia favored him with one of her radiant smiles. Still, Evangeline told herself that this was only natural. Lydia possessed the sort of beauty that commanded attention from any man with eyes to see, and it would be unreasonable to expect even Alexander to be immune to her charms. What mattered was that he continued to call, continued to show her the same thoughtful consideration as before, and had given no indication that his feelings toward her had altered in any meaningful way. She clung to these reassurances even as a small voice in her heart whispered warnings she was not yet prepared to hear. It was on a particularly warm afternoon in late May that Evangeline's carefully constructed defenses finally crumbled beyond repair. She had been arranging flowers in the morning room when she heard voices drifting through the open window that faced onto the small garden behind their house. Alexander's distinctive baritone was unmistakable, as was the silvery laughter that could only belong to Lydia, and curiosity, rather than suspicion, drew Evangeline closer to the window to observe them walking among the roses that were her mother's pride and joy. They made a picture of such perfection that it might have been painted by one of the masters, Alexander's dark elegance providing the ideal contrast to Lydia's golden beauty, their heads bent together in intimate conversation as they strolled along the gravel path. Evangeline told herself she should withdraw, should respect their privacy and return to her flower arranging, yet something held her frozen at the window, some premonition that what she was about to witness would change everything forever. "Miss Lydia," Alexander was saying, his voice carrying clearly on the still air, "I confess myself quite overwhelmed by your beauty. In all my travels, in all the courts of Europe I visited during the war, I have never encountered anyone who could compare to your perfection. You are like something from a fairy tale, too lovely for this mundane world." Lydia's response was characteristically modest, though her pleasure at the compliment was evident in the becoming blush that colored her porcelain cheeks. "Your Grace, you flatter me terribly. Surely there have been many ladies more worthy of such praise." "No," Alexander replied with a vehemence that made Evangeline's knees weak with dread. "There have not. You are perfection itself, Miss Lydia, everything that is beautiful and good and pure in this world. I find myself quite unable to think of anything else since the night of your debut." Each word felt like a physical blow to Evangeline's heart, yet she remained paralyzed at the window, unable to look away even as her world crumbled around her. This was not mere gallantry or social pleasantries, but a declaration of feeling so heartfelt and passionate that there could be no mistaking its sincerity. The man who had spoken to her of solace and understanding, who had made her believe that she alone possessed what he needed, was now offering those same deep feelings to her sister with an intensity that left no room for doubt about where his true affections lay. The library had always been Evangeline's sanctuary within the modest confines of her family's townhouse, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that offered escape from the increasingly suffocating reality of her daily existence. It was here that she had spent countless hours with Alexander during his visits, discussing literature and philosophy in conversations that had led her to believe their minds were perfectly matched, their souls destined for union. Now, as she stood before the window overlooking the small garden where only days before she had witnessed his passionate declaration to Lydia, the room felt more like a tomb than a refuge, heavy with the weight of shattered dreams and abandoned hope. She had requested this private audience with Alexander under the pretense of discussing a book he had lent her, though they both knew that literature was far from her mind as she waited for him to speak. He stood near the marble fireplace, his usually commanding presence diminished by what appeared to be genuine discomfort, his dark eyes unable to meet hers directly as the silence stretched between them like a chasm that neither seemed willing to bridge. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, Evangeline gathered her courage and spoke the words that would forever alter the careful pretense they had maintained. "Your Grace, I believe we must speak plainly about what has transpired these past weeks. I am not blind to the change in your attentions, nor to the cause of that change." Alexander's head snapped up at her direct address, surprise and something that might have been relief flickering across his scarred features. "Miss Evangeline," he began, then stopped, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of frustration she had never seen from him before. "You are correct that we must speak plainly. I have been a coward in avoiding this conversation, and you deserve better from me. I thought I knew my heart when I first began calling upon your family, believed myself certain of my feelings and intentions. But your sister, she is everything a duchess should be, everything society expects and demands. She is perfection in a way that I never anticipated encountering, and I find myself quite powerless against her charms. The admission struck Evangeline like a physical blow, though she had known it was coming since that devastating afternoon in the garden. She forced herself to remain perfectly still, her hands clasped before her with practiced composure, even as her heart shattered into fragments too small to ever reassemble. "I see," she replied, proud of how steady her voice remained despite the turmoil raging within her chest. "And what of the conversations we have shared, the understanding you claimed to find in my company? Were those feelings false, or merely insufficient when measured against my sister's superior attractions?" Alexander flinched as though she had struck him, his eyes finally meeting hers with an expression of genuine anguish that might have moved her to pity under different circumstances. "They were not false," he said quietly. "Never false. The peace I found in your presence, the solace you offered, these things were real and precious to me. But peace and solace, while valuable, are perhaps not sufficient foundation for a marriage that must bear the weight of ducal responsibilities and social expectations. Your sister possesses not only beauty, but the sort of vibrant charm that will grace my position admirably. She will make a duchess that society will celebrate, while I—" He paused, struggling with words that clearly pained him, "while I fear that a quieter soul, however dear, might find the demands of my station overwhelming." The cruel practicality of his reasoning was like salt in wounds already raw with betrayal. Yet Evangeline recognized the truth within his words, even as they destroyed her last fragile hopes. She had always known that her modest accomplishments and reserved nature made her an unlikely candidate for such an elevated position, had tried to tell herself that love might overcome such obstacles, but Alexander's choice made clear that duty and appearance would always triumph over deeper compatibility. "Your Grace," she said with a dignity that would have made her ancestors proud, "you need offer no justifications for your choice. Lydia is indeed everything you describe, and I am certain she will fulfill the role of duchess with grace and beauty. I wish you both every happiness, and I hope you will forgive any presumption on my part in assuming your intentions toward me were more particular than they truly were." Alexander stepped toward her, his expression stricken as the full impact of her words reached him. "Miss Evangeline, surely you cannot think that I regarded our friendship as mere pleasantry. Your feelings, your heart, they were never inconsequential to me. Even now I cherish the understanding we have shared, the way you have seen beyond the surface to the man beneath the title. If circumstances were different, if I were free to choose based solely on the inclinations of my heart rather than the demands of my position, then perhaps—" But he stopped abruptly, apparently realizing that such words offered only additional pain rather than comfort. Evangeline felt a bitter smile touch her lips as she absorbed this final cruelty, the admission that he had indeed felt something genuine for her, but had chosen to abandon it in favor of what society demanded. "If circumstances were different," she repeated softly, "but they are not, and we must both accept the realities before us. I confess I had hoped, had allowed myself to believe that what we shared might transcend such considerations, but I see now how foolish such dreams were. You are a duke. I am merely a baron's daughter with little to recommend me beyond a modest talent for music and an unfortunate tendency toward romantic fancy." The pain in Alexander's eyes deepened as he heard her diminish herself, and for a moment Evangeline thought he might contradict her harsh assessment, might offer some word of comfort or reassurance that would ease the ache in her chest. Instead, he seemed to gather himself, straightening into the formal bearing she had come to associate with his public persona rather than the more relaxed manner he had shown in her company. "Miss Evangeline, I hope that in time you will understand that my choice, while painful for us both, serves the greater good. Your sister and I, we will make a match that strengthens both our families and fulfills the expectations of our stations. I pray that you will find it in your heart to forgive me, and perhaps, in time, to regard me as a friend rather than as one who has caused you pain." Evangeline inclined her head in acknowledgement, though the gesture cost her every ounce of strength she possessed. "Of course, Your Grace. I am certain that time will indeed heal any temporary discomfort I might feel, and I look forward to welcoming you as a brother once you and Lydia are wed. Now, if you will excuse me, I find myself rather fatigued and should perhaps rest before dinner." She moved toward the door with careful, measured steps, determined to escape before her composure finally cracked beyond repair. Alexander's voice stopped her as her hand touched the handle, his words carrying a note of desperation that she had never heard from him before. "Evangeline, please know that if there were any other way, any possibility of choosing differently without bringing scandal and ruin upon us all, I would take it without hesitation. You must believe that this decision brings me no joy, only the satisfaction of duty fulfilled." Without turning back, she replied quietly, "I do believe you, Alexander, and that perhaps makes it hurt all the more." Then she fled, her dignity intact, but her heart lying in ruins behind her. The following weeks passed in a haze of carefully maintained normalcy as Evangeline retreated from society under the pretense of a recurring illness that conveniently prevented her from attending the round of parties and gatherings where she might be forced to witness Alexander's courtship of her sister. From her bedroom window, she watched the steady stream of callers who continued to visit Lydia, noted how Alexander's arrivals became more frequent and his departures more reluctant, observed the growing intimacy between them with the detached fascination of someone watching a particularly compelling but tragic play. Lydia, bless her innocent heart, attempted repeatedly to draw Evangeline into her excitement, sharing every detail of her conversations with Alexander, analyzing every gesture and glance for signs of his deepening attachment, completely oblivious to the agony these confidences caused her elder sister. During these one-sided conversations, Evangeline perfected the art of listening with apparent interest, while her soul slowly bled, offering appropriate encouragements and advice, while dying a little more with each shared secret. It was during one of these torturous sessions that Lydia revealed the growing certainty of Alexander's intentions. "Oh, Evangeline?" she breathed, her blue eyes sparkling with joy as she perched on the edge of her sister's bed. "I believe the Duke means to offer for me very soon. Yesterday when we walked in the park, he spoke of the future in such a way that I could not mistake his meaning, and Mamma has hinted that Papa has given him permission to address me formally. Is it not the most romantic thing imaginable? A duke, and such a handsome, distinguished one, choosing little me from all the beauties of London." Evangeline managed to produce a smile that felt like stretching broken glass across her features as she replied, "It is indeed a fairy tale come to life, dearest. You will make the most beautiful Duchess London has ever seen, and Alexander is fortunate beyond measure to have won your affections. I am so very happy for you both." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, yet she delivered it with such convincing warmth that Lydia threw her arms around her in an enthusiastic embrace, chattering on about wedding plans and duchess duties with the breathless excitement of a girl whose every dream was about to come true. That night, alone in her darkened room, Evangeline finally allowed herself to cry. Deep, silent sobs that shook her entire body as she mourned not only the loss of Alexander, but the death of her own naive belief that love might somehow conquer the harsh realities of their world. The grand ballroom of Devonshire House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles as London's elite gathered for what promised to be the season's most spectacular event, an assembly that would be remembered and discussed for months to come. Evangeline stood in the shadows near the musician's alcove, having finally succumbed to her mother's insistence that she abandon her sickroom and make an appearance lest society begin to speculate about the nature of her mysterious ailment. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the auburn highlights in her chestnut hair, though she felt as insubstantial as a ghost haunting the edges of a celebration that had nothing to do with her. Across the glittering expanse of the dance floor, Lydia moved through the crowd like a goddess among mortals, her gown of pristine white satin making her appear almost ethereal in the golden light, her beauty so radiant that even the most jaded members of society paused in their conversations to admire her passage. Alexander remained constantly at her side, his dark elegance, the perfect complement to her golden perfection. Their every interaction watched with the sort of avid attention reserved for momentous occasions. Evangeline had known what this evening would bring, had steeled herself for the inevitable announcement that would seal her fate and secure her sister's future, yet she found herself unprepared for the actual moment when Alexander led Lydia to the center of the ballroom and requested the attention of the assembled company. The Duke of Ravenshollow's voice carried easily across the suddenly silent room as he began to speak, his words formal, yet infused with genuine warmth that made Evangeline's heart clench with remembered pain. "My lords and ladies," he announced, his scarred hand clasping Lydia's gloved fingers as she gazed up at him with adoring eyes. "I have the honor to announce my engagement to Miss Lydia Ashworth, daughter of the Earl of Ashworth. She has consented to become my Duchess, and I count myself the most fortunate of men to have secured the affections of one so beautiful, so perfect in every regard." The explosion of applause and congratulations that followed seemed to come from a great distance, as though Evangeline were hearing it through layers of cotton or from the bottom of a deep well. She watched as society's most influential figures pressed forward to offer their felicitations, observed the Earl's obvious relief and satisfaction at having secured such an advantageous match for his daughter, noted her mother's tears of joy as she embraced her future son-in-law. Through it all, Lydia glowed with happiness so pure and radiant that even in her anguish, Evangeline could not begrudge her sister this moment of triumph. This was what Lydia had been born for, what her beauty and charm had always promised, and if the cost of that happiness was Evangeline's own broken heart, then that was simply the way of the world. As the evening progressed, and the engagement became the sole topic of conversation, Evangeline found herself approached by well-meaning acquaintances who offered congratulations on her family's good fortune and speculated about her own marital prospects, now that her sister had made such a brilliant match. She responded to these comments with practiced grace, accepting praise for Lydia's beauty and accomplishments, while deflecting questions about her own future with the sort of diplomatic skill that would have served a duchess well, though such irony was lost on those who sought only gossip to fuel their own social machinations. It was during one of these exhausting exchanges that she became aware of a presence at her elbow. A gentleman who had been observing her performance with what appeared to be genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. Benedict Ashworth, her cousin from the scholarly branch of the family, stood quietly beside her, his thoughtful brown eyes holding an understanding that made her suddenly afraid she might disgrace herself with tears. "Miss Evangeline," he said softly when the gossiping matrons had finally moved on to fresh prey, "perhaps you would honor me with a turn about the room. I find the air rather close in here, and I suspect you might benefit from a moment's respite as well." She accepted his offered arm gratefully, allowing him to guide her through the crowd toward the relative quiet of the adjacent reception room where they might speak without fear of being overheard. Benedict had always been the most perceptive member of their extended family, a scholar of ancient languages who possessed the sort of quiet wisdom that came from extensive reading and careful observation of human nature. At 28, he was considered something of an eccentric by society standards, more interested in his research than in the pursuit of fortune or fashion, yet Evangeline had always found his company restful, in a way that few others provided. The morning of Lydia's wedding dawned with the sort of crystalline perfection that poets might have ordered from heaven itself, every detail conspiring to create a day worthy of a fairy tale princess claiming her destined throne. St. George's Hanover Square had been transformed into a floral paradise, white roses and orange blossoms cascading from every available surface, while the ancient stones seemed to glow with anticipation of the momentous ceremony they would witness. Evangeline stood before the mirror in the bride's dressing room, adjusting the pale yellow silk of her maid-of-honor gown with hands that trembled despite her determined efforts at composure, watching her reflection practice the serene smile she would wear throughout the torturous hours ahead. The irony of her position was not lost on her, standing as witness to her sister's triumph while her own heart lay in ruins, expected to radiate joy for a union that represented the death of every dream she had ever dared to harbor. Lydia herself was a vision of bridal perfection, her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls threaded with pearls, her gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace transforming her into something almost otherworldly in its beauty. The diamond tiara that would soon crown her as the Duchess of Ravenshollow caught the morning light and threw rainbows across the walls, while her blue eyes sparkled with happiness so pure and radiant that even Evangeline's broken heart could not help but respond to its infectious joy. "Dearest sister," Lydia breathed, reaching for Evangeline's hands with the unconscious grace that marked everything she did, "can you believe this day has finally come? In just a few hours I shall be Alexander's wife, a duchess, the most fortunate woman in all of England. I feel as though I might float away with happiness if you were not here to anchor me to earth." Evangeline squeezed her sister's fingers gently, forcing warmth into her voice as she replied, "You look absolutely ethereal, Lydia. Alexander will be struck speechless when he sees you walking down the aisle, and all of London will weep at your beauty. This is your day, your moment of triumph, and you deserve every bit of happiness that awaits you." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, yet she delivered them with such convincing sincerity that Lydia's face lit up with additional radiance, her joy multiplying as she basked in her beloved sister's approval. The Earl appeared in the doorway, resplendent in his finest coat, and looking more relaxed than Evangeline had seen him in months, his gambling debts soon to be resolved through this advantageous alliance that would restore the family's fortunes. "My beautiful daughters," he announced with genuine pride, "the carriages await, and I believe it is time we proceeded to fulfill destiny itself." The short journey to the church passed in a blur of waving crowds and excited chatter from Lydia, who seemed determined to share every thought and feeling with her maid-of-honor, while Evangeline nodded and smiled with mechanical precision. The assembled congregation rose as one when they entered the sanctuary, the collective intake of breath at Lydia's beauty audible even above the magnificent organ music that filled the sacred space with triumphant melody. Evangeline took her position near the altar, her gaze carefully fixed on the spectacular arrangements of white roses that adorned every pillar and arch, determined not to look toward the front of the church where Alexander waited in his dress uniform. The dark blue fabric with its gold braiding emphasizing his military bearing and the aristocratic perfection of his features. Yet when the moment came for the bridal party to turn and face the congregation, when Lydia's hand was formally placed in Alexander's and they stood together before God and society to pledge their eternal devotion, Evangeline found her treacherous eyes drawn inexorably to the man who had once made her believe in love's transformative power. He was magnificent in his ducal splendor, every inch the fairy tale prince that Lydia deserved, his scarred face softened by an expression of wonder as he gazed down at his bride with obvious adoration. The sight should have brought Evangeline satisfaction, proof that her sacrifice had secured her sister's happiness. Yet instead, it felt like watching her own funeral, the final burial of hopes that had once seemed as real and solid as the ancient stones surrounding them. The ceremony proceeded with the stately grandeur befitting a ducal wedding, each ritual word and gesture carrying the weight of centuries of tradition as Alexander and Lydia pledged to love and honor each other until death should part them. When the Archbishop asked if any present knew of any lawful impediment to this union, the silence that fell over the congregation was absolute, yet Evangeline felt as though her breaking heart might betray her with some involuntary cry of protest. Instead, she maintained her perfect composure, her face a mask of serene approval, even as her soul screamed in anguish at hearing Alexander promise to another woman the very devotion she had once believed might be hers. It was during the exchange of rings that disaster nearly struck, when Alexander's gaze strayed from his bride's radiant face to meet Evangeline's eyes across the short distance that separated them. The connection lasted only a moment, yet in that brief instant she saw reflected in his grey eyes something that might have been regret, perhaps even longing, a flash of the understanding they had once shared before duty and propriety had claimed him for her sister. His voice faltered slightly as he repeated the ancient vows, and for one heart-stopping moment Evangeline wondered if he might actually hesitate, might allow his true feelings to override the calculated choice he had made. But the moment passed, his attention returned to Lydia with renewed focus, and the ceremony continued without further interruption. When the Archbishop finally pronounced them husband and wife, when Alexander lifted Lydia's veil and kissed her with tender reverence while the congregation erupted in celebration, Evangeline felt something inside her chest finally break beyond all hope of repair. She applauded with the rest of the assembly, her smile never wavering even as tears she refused to shed burned behind her eyes like liquid fire. The recessional seemed to take an eternity, the newlywed Duke and Duchess moving slowly down the aisle while acknowledging the congratulations of their guests, Lydia's face glowing with happiness as she clung to her husband's arm like a woman who had just claimed her heart's desire. Evangeline followed at the prescribed distance, her role as maid of honor requiring her to maintain the perfect picture of familial joy, while inside she felt as hollow and lifeless as an abandoned shell. The wedding breakfast at Devonshire House was a masterpiece of social orchestration, every detail designed to celebrate the union of two of society's most prominent figures, while providing ample opportunity for the guests to see and be seen. Evangeline moved through the festivities like an actress playing a role she had rehearsed to perfection, accepting congratulations on her family's good fortune, discussing wedding details with interested matrons, and deflecting questions about her own romantic prospects with practiced grace. She watched Alexander and Lydia receive the homage of their guests, observed how naturally they fit together in their roles as Duke and Duchess, noted the way Alexander's attention never strayed from his bride's beautiful face. They were indeed the perfect couple, everything society demanded and expected, and if the cost of that perfection was the destruction of Evangeline's dreams, then that was simply the price that had to be paid for the greater good. When the time came for the speeches, she listened with apparent interest as various dignitaries praised the bride's beauty and the groom's distinguished service to the crown, though their words seemed to come from a great distance, as though she were hearing them through thick glass. The Earl's toast to his daughter's happiness was particularly difficult to endure, his obvious relief and satisfaction at having secured such an advantageous match, a painful reminder of the practical realities that governed their world. Even Benedict's thoughtful remarks about the nobility of love and the importance of mutual respect in marriage, delivered with the scholarly precision that marked all his public speaking, failed to penetrate the protective numbness that had settled over her wounded heart. The moment Evangeline had been dreading most arrived with the announcement that the Duke and Duchess must depart for their wedding journey, a month-long tour of Alexander's various estates that would culminate in an extended stay at his principal seat in Yorkshire. The ritual of throwing rice and flower petals provided welcome activity for hands that might otherwise have trembled, and she joined enthusiastically in the celebration, even as each grain that struck the ducal carriage felt like a small stone thrown at her own grave. Lydia's farewell embrace was particularly torturous, her sister's happiness so genuine and overwhelming that Evangeline found herself momentarily infected by its radiance, despite the agony in her chest. "Dearest Evangeline," Lydia whispered against her ear, "thank you for everything, for all your love and support through these magical weeks. I am so grateful to have you as my sister, and I promise to write every detail of our journey so you might share in my adventures. I love you more than words can express, and I shall miss you dreadfully until we return to London." Evangeline held her sister tightly, memorizing the warmth of her embrace and the sweet scent of orange blossoms in her hair, knowing that when Lydia returned she would be forever changed. Transformed from a beloved sister into the untouchable figure of a duchess whose life would move in spheres far removed from Evangeline's modest existence. When Alexander approached to bid her farewell, she steeled herself for what would likely be their final private exchange, determined to send him away with no shadow of doubt about her complete acceptance of his choice. "Your Grace," she said with a perfectly calibrated curtsy, "I wish you and Lydia every happiness in your married life. May your union be blessed with joy, prosperity, and the deep contentment that comes from a love truly matched." Alexander's response was everything proper courtesy demanded, yet she thought she detected something almost desperate in his eyes as he replied, "Miss Evangeline, your sister and I are fortunate indeed to have your blessing. I hope that when we return to London, you will honor us frequently with your presence at our home. Your friendship has always been precious to me, and I should be grieved indeed if marriage were to alter the regard I have long held for your wisdom and goodness." The words were carefully chosen, revealing nothing that could be construed as inappropriate, yet somehow managing to convey depths of feeling that made Evangeline's carefully maintained composure waver for just an instant. "Of course, Your Grace," she managed to reply. "You will always be welcome as family, and I look forward to many pleasant evenings in your company." Then the moment passed. Alexander handed Lydia into their elaborate carriage, and they were gone, disappearing into the London afternoon amid a shower of rose petals and the cheers of well-wishers. Evangeline stood with the other guests, waving enthusiastically until the ducal equipage vanished around the corner, and only then did she allow herself to acknowledge that the most difficult day of her life had finally ended. The journey home passed in merciful silence, her parents too exhausted by the day's emotions and excitement to maintain their usual commentary on social events, leaving Evangeline free to stare out the carriage window at the familiar streets of London while contemplating the empty years that stretched ahead of her. It was only when she finally reached the sanctuary of her own bedroom, when the door was safely closed and the servants dismissed, that she allowed the facade to crumble at last. The sobs that racked her body seemed to come from some place deeper than her chest, primal sounds of grief that she muffled in her pillows lest anyone hear and come to investigate. She wept for the death of dreams, for the loss of love, for the bitter lesson that fairy tales belonged only to the beautiful and the fortunate, while practical souls like herself must learn to find contentment in the shadows cast by others' happiness. When the tears finally stopped, she felt drained and hollow, as though some essential part of herself had been carved away, leaving only an empty shell that must somehow learn to function in a world where Alexander belonged forever to someone else. The ancient walls of Ashworth Manor had witnessed centuries of family triumphs and tragedies, but perhaps none quite so quietly devastating as the spectacle of Evangeline's voluntary exile from all that had once brought meaning to her existence. The estate lay nestled in the rolling hills of Derbyshire, its Tudor architecture and sprawling gardens providing a refuge from the glittering society that had become unbearable to one whose heart lay in ruins amid London's ballrooms and drawing rooms. Here, surrounded by the comforting silence of countryside solitude, Evangeline attempted to rebuild something resembling a life from the fragments of her shattered dreams, though the effort felt as futile as gathering morning mist in cupped hands. The weeks following her arrival passed in a blur of mechanical routine, her days structured around activities that required no emotional investment. Supervising the household, walking the familiar paths of her childhood, reading volumes from the extensive library that her grandfather had assembled during his own periods of retreat from the world. Yet even these simple occupations felt drained of meaning, as though she were performing the motions of living without truly inhabiting her own existence. The servants, long familiar with the family's occasional retreats from London society, accepted her presence with the sort of respectful discretion that made no demands upon her fragile composure, allowing her to move through the manor like a ghost haunting rooms that held memories of happier times. It was Benedict who finally disturbed this careful isolation, arriving unannounced one grey afternoon in early autumn, with the sort of quiet determination that brooked no argument. She found him in the morning room, calmly reading a volume of Cicero, as though his presence required no explanation. His travel-stained clothes and mud-splattered boots testament to a journey undertaken with more haste than comfort. "Cousin," he said without looking up from his book, "I trust you will not object to an uninvited guest who comes bearing nothing more compelling than concern for your welfare and a sincere desire for intelligent conversation. The country grows tedious when one has no one with whom to discuss the finer points of classical literature." Evangeline paused in the doorway, surprised by the relief she felt at seeing a familiar face, even one that threatened to penetrate the protective numbness she had cultivated so carefully. "Benedict, what brings you so far from your books and research? Surely the university has not granted you such an extended leave from your scholarly duties?" He closed the volume and regarded her with those thoughtful brown eyes that seemed to see far more than most people revealed, his expression holding the sort of gentle understanding that made pretense impossible. "The university can spare me for a few weeks, particularly when family duty calls. I confess myself concerned about reports of your health, and I thought perhaps a change of air might prove beneficial to us both. The country offers certain advantages for serious study that London sadly lacks, and I find myself in need of peaceful surroundings to complete a rather complex translation." His excuse was transparently fabricated, yet delivered with such matter-of-fact conviction that Evangeline found herself almost smiling for the first time in weeks. "You are a terrible liar, Benedict, but I confess your company would be welcome. The manor grows rather quiet with only my thoughts for conversation, and I fear they have proven poor companions of late." Over the following days, Benedict established himself as the most undemanding of house guests, pursuing his supposed research with scholarly dedication, while somehow always being available when Evangeline found herself in need of distraction from the circular patterns of her own melancholy. The morning light filtering through the diamond-paned windows of Ashworth Manor's morning room carried the peculiar quality of early autumn, golden and slanted in a way that spoke of endings and transformations, though Evangeline barely noticed as she bent over the ledgers spread across the mahogany writing desk. 5 years of managing the estate's affairs had given her a competence in practical matters that would have surprised her younger self, the naive girl who had once believed that romantic love was the only ambition worthy of a woman's attention. Now, at 27, she had learned to find satisfaction in more tangible accomplishments: the repair of tenant cottages, the establishment of a school for the village children, the careful stewardship of resources that kept the estate profitable despite her father's continued weakness for games of chance. Her correspondence lay neatly sorted beside the account books, letters from various charitable organizations in London seeking her support, invitations to local social gatherings that she would politely decline, and a thick packet from her publisher regarding the modest success of her anonymously published collection of moral tales for young ladies. The latter had provided both income and purpose, though she had been careful to ensure that no one in her family suspected the source of her small but steady earnings. Benedict had become a frequent visitor during these years, his presence at the manor so regular that the servants had long since ceased to remark upon it, though Evangeline remained steadfast in her refusal to encourage the patient courtship that anyone with eyes could see he was conducting. She valued his friendship too much to risk destroying it through a marriage that could offer him nothing more than companionship and duty, having learned too well the bitter lesson that hearts, once broken, never quite resumed their original shape. Their conversations had evolved into a comfortable routine of intellectual discourse and gentle companionship, Benedict seeming content to wait indefinitely for some sign that her feelings might deepen beyond grateful affection, while Evangeline held firm to her determination that she would never again make the mistake of confusing gratitude with love. It was into this carefully constructed peace that disaster arrived in the form of an express messenger, his mud-splattered horse and urgent manner sending the household into immediate alarm as he delivered a letter bearing the Ravenshollow seal in black wax. Evangeline's hands trembled as she broke the seal, her mind already racing through terrible possibilities, though nothing could have prepared her for the stark brutality of the message within. The Duchess of Ravenshollow had died 3 days previous following a difficult childbirth, leaving behind an infant daughter and a husband described by the family physician as being quite overcome with grief and unable to manage even the most basic requirements of daily existence. The letter, penned by the ducal secretary in clearly shaking hand, begged Evangeline's immediate presence at Ravenshollow House for the sake of the orphaned child, who had no other female relations capable of providing proper care. Reading those terrible words, Evangeline felt the carefully constructed walls she had built around her emotions begin to crumble, 5 years of determined composure dissolving in the face of a loss that struck at the very foundations of her world. Lydia was dead, her beautiful, vivacious sister reduced to a few lines of formal notification, her golden laughter silenced forever by the very joy she had sought in marriage and motherhood. The bitter irony was not lost on Evangeline that the fairy tale romance that had cost her own happiness had ultimately destroyed the very woman it was meant to elevate, claiming Lydia's life in exchange for the ducal heir that society demanded. Yet beneath her grief lay something more complex and troubling, an unwelcome flutter of concern for Alexander's suffering that she had no right to feel and no desire to examine too closely. The man who had chosen duty over love, who had abandoned her for her sister's superior charms, was now paying the ultimate price for that choice, and she found herself torn between satisfaction at poetic justice and genuine anguish at imagining his pain. Most immediate, however, was the plight of little Cordelia, a child who had never known her aunt, but who would now depend entirely upon her care and protection. The decision to return to London required no deliberation, despite the obvious dangers such a course presented to her. Hard-won equilibrium. A 4-year-old child had prior claim over any considerations of personal comfort or emotional safety, and if that meant confronting the ghosts of her abandoned dreams, then that was simply the price of family duty. The journey to London passed in a haze of memory and apprehension as Evangeline's well-sprung carriage covered the familiar miles between her sanctuary and the scene of her greatest heartbreak. The countryside rolled past in autumn splendor, the changing leaves providing a melancholy backdrop for thoughts that refused to remain focused on practical concerns despite her best efforts. She had not seen Alexander since his wedding day, had deliberately avoided any social gathering where such an encounter might occur during her brief visits to town, yet now she would be living under his roof, managing his household, caring for his child. The implications of such intimacy were both thrilling and terrifying, threatening to awaken feelings she had spent 5 years learning to suppress. Benedict had offered to accompany her, his concern for her welfare evident in every carefully chosen word, yet she had declined his escort with a firmness that brooked no argument. This was something she must face alone. Without the buffer of his protective presence or the complications his obvious devotion might create in an already difficult situation. Ravenshollow House stood on Grosvenor Square like a monument to ducal power and privilege, its imposing Portland stone facade unchanged despite the tragedy that had recently befallen its occupants. Yet as Evangeline's carriage drew to a halt before the grand entrance, she could not help but notice the subtle signs of household disruption. Windows that should have been spotless, showing traces of neglect, brass fittings that lacked their usual gleaming perfection, an overall air of subdued confusion that spoke of a staff operating without proper direction. The butler who admitted her was clearly struggling to maintain the standards expected of a ducal establishment, his usual imperturbable demeanor cracking as he attempted to explain the current state of affairs. "Miss Ashworth, if I may say so, your arrival is most providential," he began, his voice carrying a note of barely controlled desperation. "His Grace has been that is to say, since Her Grace's passing, the household has found it difficult we have all been rather at 6s and 7s, miss, if you take my meaning." The implications of his stumbling explanation became clear as Evangeline was conducted through corridors that should have been bustling with activity, but instead felt eerily silent and neglected. Servants moved about their duties with the uncertain manner of people operating without clear instructions, while the very air seemed heavy with unspoken grief and confusion. It was in the nursery that she encountered the most heartbreaking evidence of the household's distress, for little Cordelia sat alone in a room that should have been filled with warmth and activity, but instead felt cold and abandoned. The child was beautiful in the way that only 4-year-old girls can be, her golden hair so like her mother's that Evangeline felt her breath catch, her blue eyes wide with the sort of confused fear that children develop when their world has suddenly become unpredictable and strange. She wore a black dress that was clearly too large for her small frame, the sight of such formal mourning on one so young striking Evangeline as both appropriate and unutterably sad. "Hello, Cordelia," Evangeline said gently, settling herself at the child's level and offering a smile she hoped appeared more confident than she felt. "I am your Aunt Evangeline, your mamma's sister. I have come to take care of you and make sure you are safe and loved." The little girl regarded her with solemn attention, her thumb finding its way to her mouth in a gesture that spoke of recent trauma and confusion. "Mamma went away," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Papa cries and won't come see me any more. The nursemaid says Mama is with the angels now, but I want her to come back and sing to me like she used to." The simple honesty of childhood grief struck Evangeline like a physical blow, yet it also provided her with the clarity of purpose she needed to navigate the emotional minefield that lay ahead. Whatever complicated feelings Alexander's presence might awaken, whatever ghosts their renewed proximity might resurrect, her primary responsibility was clear. This frightened little girl needed stability, love, and the sort of maternal care that only a woman could provide, and Evangeline would ensure she received it regardless of the personal cost. Taking charge of the Ravenshollow household proved easier than Evangeline had anticipated, perhaps because the staff was so desperate for competent direction that they accepted her authority without question, grateful to have someone who could make decisions and restore order to their disrupted routines. She established herself in a suite of rooms near the nursery, close enough to provide immediate comfort if Cordelia needed her during the night, but distant enough from the family quarters to maintain proper boundaries. Her first priority was the child herself, who proved to be both intelligent and surprisingly resilient despite her recent trauma. Responding to Evangeline's patient care with a trust that was both touching and heartbreaking. Within days, the nursery had been transformed from a place of neglect into a warm, nurturing environment where a little girl might begin to heal from the incomprehensible loss that had shattered her young world. Establishing proper meals, regular bedtimes, and gentle educational activities provided structure that Cordelia seemed to crave, while Evangeline's presence during the long evenings offered comfort when memories of her mother threatened to overwhelm her small understanding. It was during these quiet times, reading stories or singing the lullabies that Lydia had once sung, that Evangeline felt closest to her lost sister, as though caring for her daughter was a way of honoring the love they had shared, despite the pain that had come between them. The household gradually began to function with something approaching its former efficiency, as Evangeline worked with the housekeeper to restore proper routines, though the master of the house remained conspicuously absent from these improvements. Alexander had not appeared since her arrival 3 days earlier, keeping to his private apartments in a state of seclusion that worried the staff and left many important decisions hanging in limbo. It was the butler who finally approached Evangeline with the delicate suggestion that perhaps she might consider speaking with His Grace about various matters requiring his attention, though his manner suggested that previous attempts to rouse the Duke had met with little success. Finding herself outside the door to Alexander's private study required more courage than Evangeline had expected, her hand hovering over the polished brass handle as she struggled with emotions she thought she had long since conquered. 5 years had done little to diminish the effect of his proximity, and she could feel her pulse quickening at the mere thought of seeing him again, even under such tragic circumstances. When her knock received no response, she took the liberty of entering unannounced, her concern for the household's welfare overriding considerations of propriety. The sight that greeted her was both shocking and pitiful. Alexander sat slumped in a chair before the empty fireplace, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and unkempt, his face bearing the haggard look of a man who had forgotten how to sleep, or eat, or care for his most basic needs. Grief had aged him beyond his 33 years, adding lines around his eyes and silver to his dark hair, while his powerful frame seemed diminished by the weight of loss he carried. "Your Grace," she said softly, not wanting to startle him from whatever dark thoughts occupied his mind. "The household requires your attention on several matters, and Cordelia is asking for her papa." At the sound of her voice, Alexander's head snapped up with an expression of such startled recognition that Evangeline wondered if he had even been aware of her presence in his home. "Evangeline," he said hoarsely, his voice rough from disuse. "You came. I was not certain, sir, when Morrison sent the letter, whether you would, given our history, given how things were between us." "Of course I came," she replied simply. "Cordelia needed me, and family obligations transcend personal considerations. She is a beautiful child, Alexander, and she needs her father now more than ever. Your grief is understandable, but you cannot lose both parents to death and despair." The truth of her words seemed to penetrate his fog of mourning, and for the first time since she had entered the room, his grey eyes truly focused on her face with something approaching their old intensity. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for coming, for caring for her, for still being the generous soul you always were despite having every reason to turn away from us in our hour of need." The transformation of Ravenshollow House proceeded with the sort of quiet efficiency that Evangeline had perfected during her years managing Ashworth Manor, though here the stakes felt infinitely higher and more personal than mere estate accounts and tenant concerns. Each morning brought fresh evidence of the household's gradual return to proper functioning, servants moving with renewed purpose, meals served at appropriate times, the subtle signs of order restored that marked a well-run establishment. Yet it was in the nursery that the most profound changes were taking place, as little Cordelia slowly emerged from the shell of confusion and grief that had encased her since her mother's death. The child possessed a curious combination of her parents' best qualities. Her golden hair and delicate features clearly inherited from Lydia, while her thoughtful nature and quiet intelligence seemed to echo something deeper and more substantial. She was not the sort of child who demanded constant attention through tears and tantrums, instead observing the world around her with serious blue eyes that seemed far too old for her 4 years, as though tragedy had forced an early maturity upon her young spirit. During their quiet afternoons in the nursery, Evangeline discovered that Cordelia had inherited her mother's musical ear, but preferred listening to performing, sitting contentedly while her aunt played the small pianoforte that had been installed for her education. These peaceful interludes provided both child and woman with respite from the heavy atmosphere of mourning that pervaded the rest of the house, creating a small sanctuary where laughter occasionally broke through the careful solemnity that grief demanded. The little girl's questions about her mother were heartbreaking in their innocent directness, yet Evangeline found herself able to speak of Lydia with genuine warmth, sharing memories of their childhood that painted a picture of a loving woman rather than simply focusing on the tragic circumstances of her death. "Mama was beautiful like the princesses in fairy tales, wasn't she?" Aunt Evangeline, Cordelia would say while they looked through her mother's miniature portrait. And she loved music and dancing and pretty dresses. Did she love Papa very much, the way princesses love their princes? These conversations required delicate navigation, as Evangeline struggled to honor both the truth of Lydia's happiness and the complex reality of adult relationships that a child could not possibly understand. "Yes, darling," she would reply, "your mama loved your papa very much, and they were both overjoyed when you came to complete their happiness. She would want you to remember that love, and to know that even though she cannot be with you now, that love remains forever in your heart." It was during one of these afternoon sessions that Alexander first ventured into the nursery since Evangeline's arrival, his appearance so tentative and uncertain that Cordelia initially seemed unsure whether to run to him or hide behind her aunt's skirts. The man who had once commanded battlefields and wielded ducal authority with natural confidence now seemed almost afraid of his own child, as though her innocent grief might somehow contaminate him with additional pain he lacked the strength to bear. "Papa," Cordelia said finally, her voice carrying the careful politeness of a child who has learned not to expect too much from the adults in her life. "Aunt Evangeline has been teaching me about Mama and showing me how to play the piano, just like she did. Would you like to hear me play my song?" The request clearly caught Alexander off guard, his ravaged features struggling to arrange themselves into an appropriate expression of paternal interest, though Evangeline could see the effort such simple interaction required. He settled into a chair with movements that seemed to pain him, whether from physical discomfort or emotional strain she could not determine, and listened with focused attention as Cordelia performed a simple melody with the careful concentration of a young student. When the last notes faded, his applause was genuine despite the tears that had gathered in his grey eyes, and for the first time since Evangeline's arrival, she caught a glimpse of the man she had once known beneath the ravages of grief and guilt. The weeks that followed established a routine that felt both natural and dangerously intimate, with Evangeline managing the household while Alexander slowly began to emerge from his self-imposed isolation to participate in his daughter's care. These shared responsibilities created opportunities for conversation that were both carefully proper and charged with unspoken awareness. Their interactions focused on Cordelia's welfare, yet somehow managing to resurrect the easy communication they had once enjoyed. Watching Alexander read bedtime stories to his daughter revealed a passageness that grief had not entirely destroyed, while his obvious gratitude for Evangeline's presence spoke to needs that went far beyond mere household management. She found herself remembering why she had once fallen so completely under his spell, noting how his scarred face softened when he smiled at Cordelia's innocent questions, observing the way his grey eyes still held depths that invited exploration and understanding. Yet these moments of renewed attraction were complicated by an awareness of all that lay between them, the years of separation and the ghost of Lydia that seemed to hover over every interaction. During the quiet evenings when Cordelia had been settled for the night and the household had retreated to their own concerns, Alexander began seeking out Evangeline's company in the library, where they had once discussed literature and philosophy with such pleasure. These conversations were more careful now, bounded by grief and propriety, yet gradually they began to recapture something of their former intimacy, as they found themselves able to speak freely about topics that had nothing to do with loss or regret. He told her about his estates in Yorkshire, his plans for agricultural improvements and charitable initiatives that had been abandoned in the wake of personal tragedy, while she shared her own experiences managing Ashworth Manor and her anonymous literary endeavours. These exchanges revealed how much they had both grown during their years apart, yet they also highlighted the fundamental compatibility that had once made her believe they were destined for one another. It was inevitable that society would begin to take notice of the unusual domestic arrangement at Ravenshollow House, where the Duke's sister-in-law had taken up residence as surrogate mother to his child and manager of his household. The gossips found fertile ground in speculating about the propriety of such intimacy between a widowed man and an unmarried woman, particularly given their previous acquaintance and the romantic history that a few sharp-eyed observers remembered from 5 years past. Evangeline was aware of the whispers that followed her during her brief excursions to shops and charitable meetings. The carefully worded questions about her plans for the future and her intentions regarding the Duke's household. She responded to these inquiries with the sort of dignified reserve that gave no ammunition to scandal-mongers while making clear that her only concern was Cordelia's welfare, yet she could not ignore the growing impropriety of her position or the potential damage to both their reputations if the arrangement continued indefinitely. More troubling were the moments when she caught Alexander watching her with an expression that seemed to see past her careful composure to the feelings she was struggling to suppress, his grey eyes holding a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the attraction that still simmered between them, despite all that had transpired. These charged glances across the dinner table or during their evening conversations in the library created a tension that made her increasingly uncomfortable, not because his attention was unwelcome, but because it threatened to awaken hopes she had no right to harbour. He was her dead sister's husband, the man who had chosen Lydia over her own claims to his affection, and any romantic feeling between them would be not only inappropriate, but a betrayal of the woman whose memory deserved better than such complications. Yet as autumn deepened toward winter and their shared life at Ravenshollow House took on the comfortable rhythms of an established household, Evangeline found herself fighting a losing battle against emotions that seemed to strengthen with each passing day. The evening that would prove the turning point in their carefully maintained balance arrived with the sort of quiet inevitability that made it seem both unexpected and perfectly natural. A conversation that neither had planned yet, both had been avoiding since Evangeline's arrival at Ravenshollow House. They sat in the library after dinner, the fire casting dancing shadows across the book-lined walls, while outside a November storm rattled the windows with appropriate drama. Cordelia had been settled hours earlier, her prayers said, and her small fears about the wind and rain soothed by her aunt's reassuring presence, leaving them alone with the sort of intimate privacy that had become both precious and dangerous. Alexander had been unusually quiet during dinner, his manner suggesting a man wrestling with thoughts too complex and painful for easy expression, while Evangeline had found herself equally distracted by an awareness that their current situation could not continue indefinitely without resolution. The letter from Benedict that had arrived that morning lay open on the side table, its contents having already been shared in the interest of maintaining the honest communication they had established, though both were aware that its implications went far beyond mere family correspondence. "Miss Evangeline," Alexander said finally, setting down the book he had been pretending to read and turning to face her with an expression of determined resolution. "We must speak honestly about what has developed between us these past months, about what I fear my presence has cost you and what your kindness has meant to our small household. I know that your position here has become the subject of speculation, and I would not for the world see your reputation damaged by association with our tragic circumstances." His words struck her as both considerate and somehow insulting, as though he viewed her as a victim of circumstance rather than a woman capable of making her own choices about where and how she lived. "Alexander," she replied with more sharpness than she had intended, "I am perfectly capable of managing my own reputation and making my own decisions about what sacrifices are worthwhile. My concern is for Cordelia's welfare, not for the opinions of gossips who have nothing better to occupy their minds than speculation about domestic arrangements that are none of their concern. Yes," he said quietly, "Cordelia has flourished under your care in ways that I could never have provided alone. She adores you, speaks of you constantly, and has begun to smile and laugh again in ways that I feared we had lost forever. You have given her back her childhood, Evangeline, and I am more grateful than words can express for such a gift. But it is precisely because I value what you have done, what you continue to do, that I must acknowledge the unfairness of our current situation to your own future happiness." The reference to her future struck Evangeline as particularly painful, given that she had long since accepted that her future would be one of quiet spinsterhood devoted to charitable works and literary endeavors. Benedict's letter had contained yet another gentle proposal of marriage, his patient devotion unwavering despite her continued refusal to encourage his hopes, and she wondered if Alexander had somehow intuited the contents of that correspondence. "You speak of my future as though it has somehow been compromised by caring for my sister's child," she said with rising irritation. "I am 27, Alexander, quite beyond the age when marriage proposals arrive with any frequency, and I have made my peace with a life of useful occupation rather than romantic fulfillment. If you are concerned about propriety, I can certainly make arrangements to leave Cordelia in the care of a proper governess and return to my own pursuits." "No," he said sharply, his composure cracking for the first time since the conversation began. "That is not what I meant, not what I want at all. Evangeline, these months of living in your presence, of watching you with Cordelia, of rediscovering the woman I once—" He stopped abruptly, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of frustration that she remembered all too well. What I am trying to say is that I have come to realize the magnitude of the mistake I made 5 years ago, the terrible error in judgment that cost us both so much happiness. The whispers that had begun as mere speculation among London's drawing-room gossips had evolved into something far more dangerous by the time winter settled over the city, transforming idle curiosity into pointed commentary that threatened to damage reputations built over generations of careful social navigation. Lady Pemberton's weekly salon had become ground zero for the most vicious speculation about the unusual domestic arrangement at Ravenshollow House, where the widowed Duke's sister-in-law had taken up residence with a permanence that society found increasingly improper. The matrons who gathered to dissect the moral failings of their betters found rich material in analyzing every public appearance Evangeline made, every shared carriage ride, every moment when she and Alexander were observed together while conducting the business of Cordelia's care. Mrs. Fitzwilliam, whose sharp tongue had once dismissed Evangeline as unremarkable, now proclaimed with malicious satisfaction that she had always suspected the plain Ashworth girl of harboring designs above her station, while Lady Jersey herself began to speak in carefully measured terms about the importance of proper appearances even in times of family crisis. The speculation reached its crescendo when the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshollow arrived in London from her usual residence in Bath, her ancient but still formidable presence descending upon Grosvenor Square like a force of nature determined to restore order to a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond acceptable bounds. Eleanor Blackwood had ruled society for 5 decades through a combination of aristocratic bearing, sharp intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to duty that brooked no compromise with modern sentimentality, making her the perfect instrument to address what she clearly viewed as a scandal in the making. Her arrival coincided with an invitation that Evangeline received to take tea with several of London's most influential ladies, a summons disguised as social courtesy, but clearly intended to communicate society's growing displeasure with her continued residence under Alexander's roof. The message was delivered with the sort of polite brutality that only the highest circles could manage, suggesting that while her devotion to family duty was admirable, there came a point when such dedication crossed the line into impropriety that reflected poorly on all concerned. During this uncomfortable interview, Evangeline maintained the dignified composure that had served her throughout her adult life, acknowledging their concerns with appropriate gratitude while making clear that Cordelia's welfare remained her primary consideration. Yet even her considerable poise was tested by Lady Pemberton's pointed observation that surely a child would be better served by a proper governess than by an unmarried woman whose presence created such unfortunate speculation about the Duke's household management. The implicit threat was clear: conform to society's expectations or face social ostracism that would extend to her entire family, including her parents, whose own precarious position could ill afford additional scandal. It was into this increasingly tense atmosphere that Benedict's letter arrived, its formal language barely concealing the urgency behind his renewed proposal of marriage. His previous offers had been gentle suggestions that might be declined without causing offense, but this communication carried the weight of a man who recognized crisis when he saw it and was prepared to offer rescue regardless of personal cost. He wrote of his continued devotion, his desire to protect her from the malicious speculation that was already reaching his ears even in academic circles, and his belief that their shared intellect and values provided sufficient foundation for a marriage that would offer security and respectability, if not passion. The proposal included practical details that revealed how seriously he had considered their union: a modest but comfortable living near Oxford, opportunities for her to continue her writing under proper auspices, and the promise of a life devoted to scholarly pursuits and quiet contentment, far from the glittering world that had brought her such pain. Reading his careful words in the sanctuary of her sitting room, Evangeline felt the walls closing in around her with frightening speed, as though all her carefully constructed independence was being systematically dismantled by forces beyond her control. The crisis that would ultimately force resolution of these mounting pressures arrived with the swift brutality that childhood illnesses could visit upon even the most carefully managed households. As Cordelia developed a fever that within hours had escalated to the sort of dangerous level that sent servants scurrying for physicians and filled the nursery with the sort of desperate activity that accompanied life-threatening emergencies. The little girl's robust health, which had been one of the few bright spots in the months following her mother's death, suddenly seemed as fragile as spun glass, her small body burning with heat while her breathing became labored and frightening. Dr. Hammond, the family physician who had attended Lydia during her final hours, arrived with commendable speed, but his grave expression as he completed his examination communicated more than his careful words about childhood fevers and the need for vigilant nursing care. The disease had progressed too rapidly for easy reassurance, and while he spoke optimistically about the resilience of youth and the benefits of proper treatment, his instructions for round-the-clock monitoring revealed the seriousness of Cordelia's condition. Alexander's response to his daughter's illness was immediate and total, the careful composure he had maintained during months of grief shattering in the face of this new threat to the only family he had remaining. He took up residence in a chair beside her bed, refusing all suggestions that he rest or take meals away from her side, his haggard features taking on the hollow-eyed intensity of a man who had already lost too much to bear another devastating blow. The sight of this powerful duke reduced to helpless vigil over a sick child was both heartbreaking and revealing, stripping away all pretense to expose the vulnerable man beneath the aristocratic facade. For her part, Evangeline found herself functioning with the sort of practical efficiency that emergencies demanded. Coordinating with the nursing staff to ensure Cordelia received proper care while managing the household routines that could not be allowed to lapse even in crisis. Yet her composed exterior masked a terror that went beyond normal concern for a sick child, encompassing as it did the awful possibility that fate might claim this precious link to Lydia, while simultaneously destroying Alexander's already fragile stability. During the long hours when Cordelia's fever raged at dangerous heights, when her small body seemed too frail to contain such burning heat, Evangeline and Alexander maintained their vigil with the sort of shared intensity that made all other considerations irrelevant. They took turns cooling her fevered skin with damp cloths, monitoring her breathing for any sign of distress, and offering what comfort they could to a child who drifted in and out of feverish dreams that sometimes called for her mama with heartbreaking clarity. These intimate hours of shared fear and hope created a bond between them that transcended the careful boundaries they had maintained, their mutual love for Cordelia stripping away pretense to reveal emotions that had been carefully suppressed for months. When Alexander's hand accidentally brushed hers as they both reached to adjust the child's covers, the contact sent electricity through her entire body, while his grey eyes met hers with an intensity that spoke of feelings far deeper than mere gratitude for her assistance. On the third night of Cordelia's illness, when her fever finally broke and her breathing eased into the natural rhythm of healing sleep, they found themselves alone in the candle-lit nursery with the sort of private privacy that felt both dangerous and inevitable. The relief of crisis past left them emotionally raw and unguarded, their defenses weakened by exhaustion and the profound sharing of parental terror that had occupied every moment of recent days. The confrontation with Benedict arrived at the worst possible moment, when Evangeline's emotional reserves were depleted by days of nursing a sick child, and her judgment clouded by the renewed awareness of her feelings for Alexander that the crisis had awakened. Her cousin appeared in the morning room, where she was attempting to catch up on correspondence that had accumulated during Cordelia's illness. His usually composed features showing signs of the urgent journey he had undertaken upon receiving word of both the child's condition and the growing scandal surrounding Evangeline's position. His concern was genuine and touching, encompassing both personal worry for her welfare and broader anxiety about the damage her reputation might suffer if she continued to ignore society's increasingly vocal disapproval. "Evangeline," he said without preamble, his scholarly precision abandoned in favor of direct address. "This situation has become untenable, and I cannot stand by while you sacrifice your future for a position that offers no security and considerable risk to your good name. My proposal stands, now more than ever, as the solution to difficulties that will only worsen with time. I am prepared to obtain a special license and wed you within the week if necessary, removing you from circumstances that threaten to destroy everything you have worked to build." His words struck her as both generous and somehow insulting, as though her life were a problem to be solved rather than choices to be respected, though she recognized the genuine affection behind his urgent offer. "Benedict," she replied carefully, "your concern for my welfare is deeply appreciated, but I cannot marry you as an escape from difficulties that are largely of my own making. You deserve a wife who comes to you freely, not a woman seeking refuge from the complications of her own heart." His response revealed depths of understanding that she had not credited him with possessing, his brown eyes holding a sadness that spoke of long observation and patient hope, finally acknowledged as futile. "You love him still," he said simply, not a question, but a statement of fact delivered with the sort of gentle resignation that made her heart ache for the pain she was causing. "Even after everything that has passed between you, everything that can never be undone, you love Alexander Blackwood with the sort of devotion that makes all other considerations secondary. I had hoped that time and my own constancy might eventually win your affections, but I see now that some hearts give themselves only once, completely and irrevocably." The truth of his observation hung between them like a confession she had never intended to make, yet could not bring herself to deny in the face of such honest assessment. She had indeed loved Alexander with the sort of totality that left no room for other attachments, and despite 5 years of determined effort to move beyond that attachment, her feelings remained as strong as ever, perhaps strengthened by their recent months of shared domesticity and renewed intimacy. Before she could frame a response that might soften the blow of such recognition, Alexander himself appeared in the doorway, his timing suggesting he had been seeking her out for conversation of his own. The tableau that greeted him, Benedict's obvious distress and Evangeline's uncomfortable expression, required no explanation for a man who had spent months observing their interactions with growing unease. "Ashworth," Alexander said, with the sort of formal politeness that barely concealed deeper emotions, "I trust I am not interrupting a private conversation, though I confess myself eager to discuss Cordelia's continued recovery with her devoted caretaker." The challenge implicit in his words was unmistakable, as was the possessive edge that crept into his voice when he referred to Evangeline's role in his household. Benedict's response was equally loaded with meaning, his scholarly composure reasserting itself as he replied, "Your Grace, my conversation with my cousin concerns her future welfare, a topic that I believe should be of interest to all who care for her happiness. I have offered her the security of marriage and removal from circumstances that grow daily more difficult for a woman of her character and position." The word security hung in the air between the two men like a gauntlet thrown down, each understanding perfectly the implications of such an offer and the threat it represented to the delicate balance that had been established at Ravenshollow House. Alexander's jaw tightened as he absorbed Benedict's meaning, his grey eyes flickering between Evangeline's pale face and her cousin's determined expression with growing alarm. "You speak of security," he said slowly, his voice carrying the dangerous quiet that those who knew him had learned to recognize as a warning. "But what of affection? Of compatibility? Of the deeper bonds that make marriage more than mere practical arrangement? Surely Miss Evangeline deserves consideration beyond simple refuge from temporary difficulties." Benedict's scholarly precision served him well as he replied, "I offer Miss Evangeline the devotion of years' standing, the promise of a life built on shared interests and mutual respect, and removal from a situation that threatens her reputation regardless of the nobility of her motives. These seem to me considerations worthy of any woman's attention, particularly one whose previous experience with grand passion has brought more pain than happiness." The reference to Evangeline's past suffering was expertly aimed, designed to remind both her and Alexander of the costs associated with allowing emotion to override practical considerations, yet it also served to inflame rather than diffuse the tension that crackled between the three of them. Alexander stepped fully into the room, his commanding presence making the space suddenly seem smaller and more charged with possibility. "Miss Evangeline's previous experience," he said with careful emphasis, "was the result of poor judgment on my part, mistakes that I have had ample opportunity to recognize and regret. I would not presume to influence her decision regarding your generous offer, Ashworth, yet I confess myself curious about her own feelings in the matter. Do you accept his proposal, Evangeline, or do you perhaps have other considerations that might affect such a momentous choice?" The question was clearly more than idle curiosity, carrying as it did the weight of months of unspoken tension and growing awareness between them. Yet it also placed her in an impossible position between two men whose claims on her attention were so different in nature. Benedict offered safety, respectability, and the comfortable affection of long acquaintance, while Alexander represented the sort of passionate attachment that had once nearly destroyed her peace of mind, now complicated by years of separation and the ghost of her dead sister's prior claim on his devotion. Standing in that sunlit morning room with both men awaiting her response, Evangeline felt the weight of her entire future pressing down upon her with suffocating intensity, knowing that whatever choice she made would irrevocably alter the course of all their lives. "I need time to consider such an important decision," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the turmoil in her chest. "Benedict, your offer honors me greatly, and Alexander, your concern for my welfare is appreciated, but I cannot make such a choice under pressure of immediate circumstance. Cordelia's recovery remains my primary focus, and until she is fully restored to health, I prefer to defer all other considerations." The diplomatically worded response satisfied neither man while buying her precious time to sort through emotions that seemed to grow more complicated with each passing moment. Yet even as she spoke the words, Evangeline wondered if additional time would truly provide clarity or merely postpone an inevitable reckoning with feelings that had been too long suppressed. The conservatory at Ravenshollow House had been Lydia's favorite retreat during her brief reign as Duchess, its soaring glass walls and exotic blooms providing a sanctuary where she could indulge her love of beauty without the formal constraints that governed the rest of the grand residence. Now, in the depths of winter, the space felt like a crystal cathedral dedicated to memories both precious and painful, with frost painting delicate patterns on the windows, while inside the carefully tended plants created an oasis of green warmth that seemed to exist outside the normal bounds of time and season. It was here that Evangeline sought refuge from the impossible choice that lay before her, the decision between safe contentment with Benedict and the terrifying possibility of reopening her heart to the man who had once shattered it so completely. She had dismissed the servants and requested solitude, needing space to think without the weight of expectation or observation that seemed to follow her every movement within the house. Yet her supposed private privacy was interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps on marble that announced Alexander's approach. He paused in the doorway as though seeking permission to enter what had once been his wife's domain, his expression carrying the sort of careful uncertainty that had become familiar during their months of shared domesticity. Yet beneath his composed exterior, she could sense something different, a resolution that spoke of internal battles finally concluded. "May I join you?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying none of the formal politeness that had marked their recent interactions, but instead holding the warmth of genuine request rather than ducal command. "I know that you came here seeking solitude, yet I find myself in desperate need of honest conversation before circumstances force decisions that cannot be undone." Evangeline nodded her consent, though her heart began beating with the rapid rhythm that his proximity always seemed to inspire, her body responding to his presence with an awareness that 5 years of separation had done nothing to diminish. He moved through the space with the careful precision of a man navigating sacred ground, his dark eyes taking in the blooms that Lydia had so lovingly cultivated before settling on Evangeline's face with an intensity that made her feel suddenly exposed, despite her modest afternoon dress. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of confession long suppressed, truths that seemed to have been building pressure behind the careful barriers of propriety and grief that had contained them. "Evangeline, I know that I have no right to ask anything of you after the pain I caused, after the choices I made that hurt us both so deeply. Yet I cannot stand silent while you consider marrying Ashworth out of some misguided sense of duty or desire for escape from difficulties that are largely of my own making. These months of living in your presence, of watching you with Cordelia, of rediscovering the woman whose absence has haunted me for 5 long years, they have forced me to confront truths I was too young and too foolish to recognize when they might have saved us both such anguish." His admission struck her like a physical blow, yet she forced herself to remain motionless, unwilling to reveal how deeply his words affected her, or how desperately she had longed to hear some acknowledgement of what had been lost between them. "Alexander," she replied with carefully measured composure, "the past cannot be changed, and I have made my peace with what transpired between us. You chose what you believed was right for your position and your future, and Lydia made you happy in ways that I never could have managed. There is no profit in revisiting old wounds or imagining alternative histories that serve only to increase present pain." "No," he said with sudden vehemence, moving closer until she could see the anguish in his grey eyes, the way grief and regret had carved new lines around features that had once seemed so confident and assured. "That is precisely the lie I have been telling myself for 5 years, the comfortable fiction that allowed me to live with the magnitude of my mistake. I did not choose Lydia because she made me happy, Evangeline. I chose her because I was a coward, because I allowed society's expectations and my own fear of following my heart to override the deepest truth of my existence. I loved Lydia, yes, but I was in love with you, completely and irrevocably, from the moment you played that first piece at Lady Pemberton's garden party. Every day of my marriage was a reminder of what I had sacrificed for the sake of duty and appearance, every moment of supposed happiness shadowed by the knowledge that I had abandoned the woman who truly understood my soul for one whose beauty society demanded I claim." The raw honesty of his confession left Evangeline reeling, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling in the face of words she had dreamed of hearing, yet never dared hope might actually be spoken. The pain that had been her constant companion for 5 years suddenly transformed into something else, a rage so pure and overwhelming that it threatened to consume the last vestiges of the composed woman she had worked so hard to become. "You loved me," she said, her voice rising with each word as the full implications of his admission struck home. "Yet you married her anyway, knowing that your heart belonged elsewhere, knowing that you were consigning me to a life of watching the man I adored pledge his devotion to my own sister. Do you have any conception of what that cost me, Alexander? Do you understand what it meant to stand beside Lydia as she glowed with happiness over securing the very future I had believed was meant for me? I watched you place her ring on her finger while my own heart lay bleeding at my feet, and I smiled and applauded and played the part of the devoted sister because I loved her too much to let my pain diminish her joy. For 5 years I have lived with the knowledge that I was not enough, that whatever we shared was insufficient to overcome your calculations about what made a proper duchess. And now you tell me that none of it mattered, that you threw away our happiness for the sake of appearances that meant nothing to your actual feelings." The words poured out of her like water through a broken dam, years of suppressed anguish finally finding voice in accusations that left them both shaking with the force of emotions too long contained. Alexander absorbed her fury without flinching, his face reflecting the sort of agonized acceptance that spoke of a man receiving punishment he knew was both deserved and inadequate to the scope of his crimes. "You are right," he said simply when her voice finally broke on a sob that she had been fighting to contain since his first confession. "You are absolutely right about all of it, and I deserve every word of condemnation you might speak. I was young and stupid and terrified of defying expectations that seemed so much more important than they truly were. I convinced myself that choosing Lydia was the noble course, that providing her with the security and status she deserved was more important than following the dictates of my own heart. But the truth is that I was simply afraid of loving you too much, afraid of what it might mean to choose a woman whose mind matched my own over one whose beauty satisfied society's demands, afraid of admitting that my feelings for you were so overwhelming that they made every other consideration seem insignificant. I have regretted that choice every day since, and Lydia's death has forced me to confront the ultimate cost of my cowardice. She died believing herself loved when the deepest truth was that you were always the woman who owned my heart, and that deception haunts me more than any other aspect of this tragedy. The mention of Lydia's death brought fresh pain to an already unbearable conversation, reminding both of them that their love had been built on foundations that included her sister's suffering, even if that suffering had been unknowing. Yet as Evangeline absorbed the full weight of Alexander's confession, she found her anger beginning to transform into something else, a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow that left her feeling emotionally exhausted rather than triumphant. "If that is true," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from the intensity of her previous outburst, "if you truly felt such regret about your choice, then why did you never speak of it before now? Why wait until circumstances forced the issue rather than acknowledging these feelings when they might have mattered?" "Because I am a coward," he replied simply, the stark honesty of the admission somehow more devastating than any elaborate justification might have been. "Because I was married to your sister and had no right to burden you with confessions that could only cause pain without offering hope of resolution. Because I told myself that keeping silent was the honorable course, when truly I was simply afraid of your reaction, afraid that you had moved beyond whatever feelings you once held for me and would reject my belated recognition of what we might have been together." The conversation was interrupted by the soft sound of small footsteps on marble, as Cordelia appeared in the doorway of the conservatory with the sort of perfect timing that children sometimes display when seeking attention from the adults who shape their world. Her presence immediately shifted the emotional tenor of the scene. reminding both Evangeline and Alexander that their personal drama was unfolding against the backdrop of responsibility for an innocent child whose welfare depended on the choices they made. "Papa," Cordelia said with the serious expression that had become her default since her mother's death, "Aunt Evangeline looks sad, and you look sad too. Are you being sad about Mama again? Sometimes when I'm sad about Mama, it helps to remember the happy things instead of just the missing things." The profound wisdom contained in such simple words struck both adults with the force of revelation, this 4-year-old child offering perspective that their adult complications had obscured. Alexander moved to gather his daughter into his arms, his scarred features softening as he looked down at the golden-haired little girl who represented both his greatest joy and his heaviest responsibility. "You are very wise, sweetheart," he said gently, his voice steadying as he spoke to someone whose needs were so much clearer than the tangled emotions that had been consuming his adult concerns. "Papa has been sad, and so has Aunt Evangeline. But not just about Mama. Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions about how to be happy again while still remembering the people we love who cannot be with us anymore." From her position in Alexander's arms, Cordelia regarded Evangeline with the sort of direct assessment that children employed when trying to understand adult behavior that made no sense according to their simpler logic. "Aunt Evangeline," she said with the confidence of someone stating an obvious truth, "you should marry Papa so you can live with us always, and I don't have to worry about you going away like Mama did. Then we could all be happy together and remember Mama in our hearts, but still have love every day." The innocent suggestion hung in the air between them like a challenge to their complicated adult reasoning. This child's straightforward solution to problems that seemed so much more manageable when viewed through the lens of simple affection rather than the weight of history and social expectation. Alexander's eyes met Evangeline's over Cordelia's golden head, and in his gaze she saw not the calculating duke who had once chosen duty over love, but the vulnerable man who had been slowly emerging during their months of shared domesticity. "I know I have no right to ask," he said quietly, his words addressed to her but spoken in front of the child whose future hung in the balance of her response. "I know that I forfeited any claim to your affections years ago through my own weakness and poor judgment. But if there is any possibility that you might consider giving me another chance, if the woman you have become could find it in her heart to forgive the foolish boy I was then, I swear to you that I would spend every day of our life together trying to prove worthy of the gift you would be offering. I cannot promise to deserve you, Evangeline, only to spend my life trying to be worthy of your love." The proposal was so different from anything she might have imagined during those long-ago days when she had dreamed of hearing such words from him. Stripped of the confident expectation of acceptance that had characterized his younger self, and instead offered with the humility of a man who had learned the true cost of his choices. Looking at him now, holding his daughter while offering his heart with such genuine vulnerability, Evangeline felt the last barriers around her own heart finally crumble, releasing feelings that had been carefully guarded for so many years. "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of forgiveness, hope, and love, finally acknowledged after years of suppression. The wedding that took place 6 weeks later in the private chapel at Ravenshollow's Yorkshire estate bore no resemblance to the grand spectacle that had marked Alexander's first marriage. Designed instead as an intimate celebration of love finally claimed rather than a display of dynastic alliance. The guest list included only immediate family and closest friends, with Benedict serving as one of the witnesses despite the personal pain such a role must have cost him, his scholarly grace extending to genuine wishes for Evangeline's happiness, even as his own hopes lay in ruins. The Earl and Countess of Ashworth had initially expressed concerns about the propriety of such a union so soon after Lydia's death. Yet their practical relief at seeing Evangeline finally settled overcame their scruples, particularly given the obvious devotion that Alexander showed toward their elder daughter. The ceremony itself was conducted by the local rector who had known the Blackwood family for generations, his familiar presence lending warmth to vows that were written by the couple themselves rather than drawn from traditional liturgy. When Alexander promised to cherish not only Evangeline's love, but her mind, her spirit, and her generous heart that had already proven itself in caring for his child, his voice carried the weight of hard-won understanding about what truly mattered in marriage. Evangeline's own vows acknowledged the pain they had both endured, and her forgiveness for past mistakes, promising to build their future on foundations of honesty and mutual respect, rather than the shifting sands of social expectation. Cordelia served as flower girl with the sort of serious concentration that she brought to all important tasks. Her basket of white roses scattered with the precision of someone who understood the significance of the moment, even if she could not fully grasp all its implications. Watching this precious child perform her role with such dignity, Evangeline felt her heart expand to encompass not only her love for Alexander, but her fierce protectiveness toward the daughter who had unknowingly brought them together through her need for maternal care. The wedding breakfast was held in the manor's great hall, its ancient stones warmed by firelight and the genuine affection of guests who had witnessed the long journey that brought this unlikely couple to their moment of happiness. When Alexander raised his glass to toast his bride, speaking of second chances and the courage required to claim love when it was finally offered, his words carried a sincerity that moved even the most cynical observers to acknowledge that this was indeed a marriage of true minds as well as hearts. Yet perhaps the most poignant moment of the entire celebration came when Alexander excused himself before the evening festivities, walking alone to the small cemetery, where Lydia lay beneath a monument of white marble carved with angels that seemed to watch over her eternal rest. There, kneeling beside the grave of the woman whose death had inadvertently opened the path to his true happiness, he spoke words that only the winter wind could hear, seeking forgiveness for the deception that had shadowed their marriage and promising that Cordelia would be loved and protected by a woman whose devotion could be trusted completely. When he returned to the manor, his face bore the peace of a man who had finally made his accounting with the past and found himself able to embrace the future without reservation. The months that followed their wedding brought a contentment to Ravenshollow House that had been absent since before Lydia's death, as Evangeline settled into her role as Duchess with the sort of quiet competence that made her beloved by staff and tenants alike. Her management of Alexander's various charitable interests provided an outlet for her organizational skills, while her genuine interest in the welfare of those dependent on the estate created a warmth that had been missing during the formal magnificence of the previous Duchess's reign. Cordelia flourished under the loving attention of parents who were truly devoted to each other, as well as to her. Her natural intelligence encouraged through gentle education that recognized her individual gifts rather than attempting to force her into predetermined molds. The child's attachment to Evangeline deepened into the sort of bond that made the distinction between blood relation and chosen family irrelevant, while Alexander's obvious happiness in his marriage provided the security she needed to trust that this new arrangement would prove permanent. It was on a morning in early spring, exactly 1 year after their wedding, that Evangeline found herself in the same garden where she had first encountered Alexander at Lady Pemberton's party so many years before. The space had been restored to something approaching its former glory, with new plantings and careful attention creating a setting worthy of the memories it now held. Cordelia played among the flower beds with the sort of carefree joy that spoke of a child secure in her family's love, her golden hair catching the morning sunlight as she chased butterflies with the determined concentration that marked all her pursuits. Watching his daughter's innocent happiness while his arm encircled his wife's waist, Alexander felt a peace so profound that it seemed almost impossible to credit after the years of pain and regret that had preceded this moment. "Evangeline," he said softly, his voice carrying the wonder of a man still amazed by the gift he had been given. "I realize now that I was wrong all those years ago when I told you that you were the light that guided me from darkness. The truth is far more extraordinary than that. You are not merely light, my beloved. You are the dawn that turned my night into day, transforming everything I thought I knew about happiness into something richer and more beautiful than I ever dared imagine possible." As if summoned by his words, Cordelia came running toward them with arms full of spring flowers, her face glowing with the sort of pure joy that children radiate when surrounded by love. And in that moment, Evangeline felt the last shadows of old pain finally dissolve in the warmth of a happiness that had been worth every moment of waiting to claim.